You think you're above the law, don't you? Out here in my city, you follow my rules, the officer barked, his voice dripping with disdain, the glint of his badge catching the midday sun. The man he confronted was calm, his hands visibly raised in a gesture of peace, yet his calm demeanor only seemed to fuel the officer's arrogance. Passers-by slowed their steps, hesitant, unsure if they should intervene or keep walking. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, suffocating. You don't look like you belong here, the officer sneered, stepping closer. And I don't take kindly to people like you walking around like you own the place. The word stung, but the man didn't flinch. His quiet composure contrasted sharply with the officer's aggressive stance. Yet, his restraint wasn't enough. The officer suddenly lashed out, his fist connecting hard with the man's jaw. Gasps erupted from the small crowd gathering nearby, phones raised, the hum of recording devices capturing every cruel second. "Stay down if you know what's good for you," the officer muttered, adjusting his belt as if to punctuate his point. He didn't expect the man to rise, nor did he anticipate what came next. This was no ordinary man. And what the officer didn't know was about to flip his world upside down. Just hours before, the man had been attending a meeting, one where his decisions shaped the very structure of law enforcement in the city. He wasn't just any citizen, he was the chief of police. He had chosen to walk through the streets without his uniform, a deliberate decision to connect with the city and its people, to understand their daily lives away from the walls of the department he commanded. But now, lying on the ground, blood trickling from his lip, he saw firsthand the darkness that had festered within the ranks he was responsible for leading. The officer smirked, turning to address the growing crowd. "This is what happens when you don't show respect to authority. You better learn from his mistake." The chief's mind raced. Respect? Authority? The bitter irony of the moment gnawed at him. This wasn't authority, it was tyranny. And it was his duty to end it. But not here. Not now. This fight would not be won with anger. He would make his move carefully, deliberately, ensuring that justice was not only served but seen by everyone who had watched him fall. "Are you done yet?" The chief's voice, quiet yet firm, cut through the officer's gloating. He slowly rose to his feet, brushing dust off his shirt. His eyes met the officer's, unyielding and steady, even as his lip quivered with suppressed pain. "Oh, you still have something to say, huh?" The officer chuckled darkly, stepping forward as if preparing for another strike. But this time, it wasn't the chief who flinched. The growing crowd began to murmur, some calling out, others stepping closer. Phones were still recording, capturing every word, every movement. "I said," the chief repeated, his voice carrying an edge now, "are you done?" The officer hesitated, sensing a shift he couldn't yet place. He shrugged, feigning indifference, but his eyes darted nervously to the crowd. "Yeah, we're done here," he spat, turning on his heel. "Stay out of trouble." The chief watched him walk away, his jaw tightening. Trouble? Trouble was already here. Trouble had seeped into the very foundation of the institution he had spent years trying to uphold. And now, standing in that moment of humiliation and fury, he knew what had to be done. The officer thought it was over. He thought he had won. But what would happen when he discovered the truth about the man he'd just struck? How would he face the consequences of his unchecked arrogance and abuse of power? What began as an act of prejudice and violence was about to unravel into a reckoning that no one, least of all the officer, saw coming. Would justice be served? Would the chief rise above the shame of that public moment and use it as a catalyst for change? Or would the system protect the officer once again, shielding him from the accountability he so desperately deserved? The answers lie ahead. And this is a story you won't want to miss. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and any form of discrimination. We believe in equality, respect, and justice for all. To our Black audience and allies watching this, you are seen, valued, and supported. Thank you for being here and trusting us with your time. We promise a story that delivers emotion, justice, and impactful lessons. If you enjoy narratives that shed light on important issues, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Now, sit back and enjoy this powerful story. Let's begin. It was an unusually warm spring morning in Grandview Heights, a bustling city where history and progress collided daily. Downtown, towering glass buildings cast long shadows over small, brick storefronts that had stood the test of time. Sidewalks were alive with the hum of daily life, coffee shops overflowing with patrons on laptops, street vendors calling out their prices, and the occasional laughter of children breaking through the ambient noise. This was where Daniel Carter, chief of police, had built his career and his life. A man in his early 40s, Daniel carried himself with a quiet strength. His broad shoulders and upright posture reflected years of discipline and an unshakable sense of purpose. He was respected in the department not just for his rank, but for his unwavering integrity and ability to lead with both heart and reason. Daniel believed in the law, not as a weapon, but as a shield for the vulnerable. But his position came with challenges. As a black man in law enforcement, Daniel had spent his entire career navigating the tightrope of serving a community that often mistrusted the badge while working within a system that rarely addressed its own deep-seated flaws. He'd seen it all, the quiet murmurs of doubt in his abilities when he was first promoted, the outright defiance of some officers who resented reporting to him, and the far too frequent examples of abuse of power that he fought tirelessly to root out. Still, Daniel was a man of resolve. His mornings often began with quiet reflection, sitting at the small kitchen table in his modest apartment, sipping strong black coffee while scanning the day's agenda. His teenage son, Malcolm, often teased him for his predictable routine. "Dad," Malcolm would say, shaking his head as he grabbed his breakfast, "you know they have apps for that now, right? You don't need to keep writing everything down." Daniel would smile, his deep laugh filling the room. "Maybe when you run the department, you can use your fancy apps. Until then, this old notebook works just fine." Their relationship was a cornerstone of Daniel's life. Widowed when Malcolm was just a baby, Daniel had raised his son with the same dedication he brought to his job. Malcolm, now 16, was sharp-witted and fiercely independent, traits he'd inherited from his father. They didn't always see eye to eye, what teenager and parent did, but there was a deep bond of mutual respect between them. Across town, a very different morning was unfolding. Officer Luke Mathers, a patrol cop in his late 30s, tightened the straps on his bulletproof vest and glanced at himself in the mirror. His piercing blue eyes stared back at him, a flicker of smugness playing on his lips. Luke had always considered himself a man of the law, but his interpretation of that law was narrow and often self-serving. Luke had joined the force with dreams of grandeur, of being hailed as a hero in the community. But years of routine patrols and lack of recognition had left him bitter. Over time, his frustrations turned into resentment, toward his superiors, the city's leadership, and increasingly, the people he was sworn to serve. He prided himself on being tough and no-nonsense, though his colleagues knew that often translated into aggression, particularly toward people of color. That morning, Luke's temper was already simmering. He'd received an email from the precinct about mandatory bias training sessions, a directive he immediately dismissed as unnecessary. "They want us to babysit criminals now," he muttered to himself, tossing the email aside as he grabbed his keys. Luke's patrol route took him through the city's downtown, an area he particularly disliked. He saw it as a haven for what he called troublemakers, and he often patrolled it with an air of hostility. As he cruised through the streets in his squad car, his eyes darted to pedestrians, his mind filtering them through his own distorted judgments. Meanwhile, Daniel had decided to take a rare break from his usual routine. He'd spent weeks dealing with administrative battles, budget approvals, officer evaluations, and meetings with community leaders. Today, he wanted to step away from the desk and into the streets. Not as the chief of police, but simply as Daniel, a man who loved his city despite its flaws. Dressed in a plain button-down shirt and dark jeans, Daniel blended in with the crowd as he walked through the busy streets. He stopped at a small cafe for a cup of coffee, nodding politely to the barista who handed him his order. The simplicity of the moment felt grounding, a reminder of the community he worked so hard to protect. Luke spotted Daniel as he exited the cafe. Something about the man caught his attention, perhaps it was the calm confidence in his stride or the way people seemed to instinctively give him space. But to Luke, it was something else entirely. In his mind, Daniel didn't fit in the upscale downtown area. The officer's suspicion flared, fueled by his own unchecked biases. Pulling his car to the curb, Luke stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. "Hey," he called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the street. Daniel turned, surprised but unshaken. "Yes." Daniel replied, his tone polite but firm. "You got ID on you?" Luke asked, his hand resting on his belt, close to his holster. Daniel frowned. "Is there a problem, officer?" Luke's eyes narrowed. "I'll decide that. Just show me your ID." A small crowd began to gather, sensing the tension. Daniel, unwilling to escalate the situation, reached into his pocket and handed over his ID. Luke barely glanced at it before shoving it back. "What are you doing around here?" "Walking," Daniel said simply. "Don't get smart with me," Luke snapped, his voice rising. "People like you think you can just walk around, acting like you own the place. Not on my watch." Daniel took a deep breath, suppressing the anger rising in his chest. "Officer, I don't think this is necessary," but Luke didn't let him finish. The officer stepped closer, his voice now loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Listen here, I'm the authority in this city. When I tell you to stop, you stop. When I tell you to show me something, you do it. Got it?" Daniel's silence seemed to infuriate Luke further. Without warning, the officer lashed out, striking Daniel hard across the face. Gasps erupted from the crowd, phones raised, recording the scene. Daniel stumbled but didn't fall. He stood upright, his hand touching his bruised jaw. The street fell silent except for the murmur of bystanders and the faint sound of a child asking, "Why did he hit that man?" Daniel looked directly at Luke, his calm exterior hiding the storm brewing inside. He didn't retaliate. Not here. Not now. This wasn't over. But it wasn't going to end the way Luke thought it would. The hum of the crowd lingered long after the incident. Daniel could feel their eyes on him as he stood there, motionless for a moment, his mind racing. The sting on his face wasn't just physical, it was layered with anger, humiliation, and disappointment. He wasn't just another man who had been assaulted in broad daylight, he was the chief of police. Yet, even with the authority of his position, he had chosen to remain silent in that moment, to absorb the blow rather than react. But silence didn't mean submission. Daniel turned slowly and walked away, ignoring the murmurs from onlookers. His thoughts were sharp and focused. This wasn't about his pride, it was about something much bigger. He needed to act deliberately, ensuring that what had just transpired would not be swept under the rug. Change couldn't happen if he acted impulsively. The foundation of justice had to be built on deliberate, calculated decisions. As he made his way back to the precinct, his phone buzzed repeatedly. Videos of the altercation were already spreading online. Messages from community leaders, colleagues, and even Malcolm started pouring in. The moment he stepped through the doors of the precinct, the air shifted. Conversations hushed, and heads turned. His officers knew something had happened, but no one dared to ask. Daniel moved with purpose, heading straight to his office. Once inside, he closed the door and sat down, pulling up the video on his phone. He watched it in silence, the grainy footage capturing every second of Luke's aggression and the stunned reactions of the crowd. There was a knock on the door. Daniel looked up, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said. It was Sergeant Maria Lopez, one of the most trusted members of his team. She stepped inside, her face a mix of concern and disbelief. "Chief," she began, her voice steady but cautious, "I saw the video. Are you okay?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I'm fine, Maria. Physically, at least." Maria hesitated before speaking again. This is unacceptable. That officer, Mathers, he's out of control. We've had complaints about him before, but nothing like this. What do you want to do?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. "This isn't just about me," he said finally. "It's about the system that allowed someone like him to wear a badge in the first place. We can't just fire him and call it a day. This needs to be handled the right way." Maria nodded, her respect for Daniel evident. "What's the plan?" "I'll address it," Daniel said firmly. "But not yet. Timing is everything. I need to ensure that every move we make is beyond reproach." Maria's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the weight of Daniel's words. "Whatever you need, Chief. Just say the word." As Maria left, Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The department had its share of good officers, but there were also those who resented change, who clung to outdated beliefs and practices. Luke Mathers was one of them, a symptom of a much larger problem. Meanwhile, across town, Luke was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. He sat in a diner with a few colleagues, recounting his version of the incident with exaggerated bravado. "Guy was asking for it," Luke said, leaning back in the booth, a smug grin on his face. "Walking around like he owns the place. Had to show him who's in charge." One of the officers at the table, Tom Greer, shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, Luke. That video, it doesn't look good." Luke waved him off. "People like that always make it about race. It's not my fault they don't know how to follow orders." Tom frowned but said nothing more. He had seen Luke's behavior escalate over the years, but confronting him rarely ended well. Luke was the type who thrived on intimidation, even among his peers. As the day turned into evening, the video continued to gain traction online. News outlets picked it up, and the public outcry grew louder. By the next morning, protests were already being organized outside the precinct. Signs reading, "Justice for All," and "No Badge for Racists," were held high as chants echoed through the streets. Inside, Daniel watched from a window, his face stoic. He knew the community's anger wasn't just about him, it was about years of systemic failure. He turned away from the window as his assistant knocked and entered. "Chief, the mayor's office is on the line. They want to know how you're handling this." Daniel picked up the phone, his voice calm and measured. "I'm handling it," he said. "And I'll make sure it's done right." But behind closed doors, the pressure was mounting. The mayor, concerned about the city's image, was pushing for a quick resolution, while activists demanded systemic change. Within the department, tensions were high. Some officers supported Daniel's leadership, while others whispered behind his back, their resentment barely concealed. Later that afternoon, Daniel called a meeting with his senior staff. The room was tense as he entered, his presence commanding immediate silence. "We all know why we're here," Daniel began, his voice steady. "What happened yesterday was not just an attack on me, it was an attack on everything this department is supposed to stand for. But this isn't just about one officer. This is about trust. The trust of the community, and the trust we have in each other." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "Mathers will be held accountable," Daniel continued. "But I want this to be more than a disciplinary action. We need to look at ourselves, at the culture we've allowed to exist here. Change starts now." As the meeting ended, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. But he also knew that not everyone in the room shared his vision. There were those who would resist, who would try to protect the status quo. And among them, Luke Mathers stood defiantly, his jaw clenched as he left the room. The tension continued to build over the next few days. Luke, now fully aware of Daniel's position as chief of police, began to feel the walls closing in. His arrogance gave way to paranoia as rumors of an impending investigation swirled. He tried to act unfazed, but his temper grew shorter with each passing hour. Meanwhile, Daniel worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He reviewed every complaint ever filed against Luke, uncovering a troubling pattern of behavior. He reached out to community leaders, ensuring that their voices would be part of the solution. And he prepared for the moment when the truth would come to light. The protests outside the precinct grew larger, the chants louder. Daniel stood in his office, watching the scene below. He knew the climax was near. Justice was coming, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. And Luke Mathers? He had no idea what was about to hit him. The air in the precinct conference room was heavy with tension. Officers sat around the long table, some nervously tapping pens, others stealing glances at their phones. Luke Mathers leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed defiantly, his jaw set. He was surrounded by his peers, but he felt alone. The rumors of an investigation, of possible disciplinary action, had reached him. And now, being called to this mandatory meeting felt like a setup. Daniel Carter entered the room quietly, his commanding presence enough to silence the low murmurs. He walked to the head of the table, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Luke. For a moment, neither man spoke, the unspoken tension between them as palpable as the walls enclosing them. This meeting, Daniel began, his voice calm but firm, is about accountability. Luke scoffed, leaning forward in his chair. Accountability? For what, exactly? Doing my job. Daniel ignored the outburst, placing a thick folder on the table. He opened it slowly, deliberately, revealing page after page of documented complaints against Luke, testimonies from citizens, incident reports, disciplinary notes that had somehow been buried or dismissed. For years, Daniel continued, his eyes never leaving Luke, this department has turned a blind eye to misconduct. To abuse of power. But not anymore. The officers around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others avoided eye contact altogether. Luke's face reddened as he leaned forward, his voice rising. This is ridiculous. Those complaints are just people looking to blame the cops for their problems. You know how it is, Chief. Daniel's gaze hardened. What I know, he said evenly, is that you've abused the badge you were entrusted with. I know you've intimidated, harassed, and even assaulted people who were supposed to trust you to protect them. Luke slammed his hand on the table, causing a few officers to flinch. You don't know a damn thing about me. I've been out there, risking my life, while you sit behind a desk pretending to care about this city. The room fell silent, the weight of Luke's words hanging in the air. Daniel didn't flinch. He took a deep breath before replying, his tone measured but cutting. You're right about one thing, Daniel said. I do care about this city. And that's why I can't allow someone like you to represent it anymore. Luke froze, his bravado faltering for the first time. What are you saying? Daniel slid the folder across the table. I'm saying you're done, Officer Mathers. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. And based on what we already know, I can tell you this, your days as a cop are over. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Luke shot up from his chair, his fists clenched. You can't do this. I've given years to this department. You think you can just throw me out because of some complaints? Daniel stood as well, his voice rising slightly but remaining steady. This isn't just about complaints, Luke. It's about a culture of accountability. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. You think this is easy for me? To stand here and tell you this? It's not. But it's necessary. Luke's chest heaved as he struggled to contain his anger. You're making a mistake, Chief. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just a puppet. They'll eat you alive for this. Daniel took a step closer, his eyes locked on Luke's. Let them. At least I'll know I did the right thing. Before Luke could respond, the door to the conference room opened. Maria Lopez entered, followed by a representative from the mayor's office and a legal advisor. They carried more folders, more evidence, and a camera crew followed behind them. What the hell is this? Luke demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Daniel turned to the group. This, he said, gesturing to the newcomers, is transparency. The public has a right to know how we handle situations like this. It's time to show them that no one is above accountability, not even those of us in uniform. The legal advisor stepped forward, reading Luke his rights as an internal affairs officer moved to escort him out. Luke's protests grew louder, but they were drowned out by the whispers of his peers and the clicking of cameras capturing every moment. As Luke was led away, Daniel addressed the remaining officers. This isn't just about one man, he said. This is about us as a department, as a community. If we're not willing to hold ourselves to the highest standard, how can we expect the people we serve to trust us? The room was silent, the gravity of Daniel's words sinking in. He didn't need to say anything else. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. Back in his office, Daniel sat alone, his head in his hands. The adrenaline of the confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. But there was also a sense of relief. He had done what needed to be done, no matter how difficult it had been. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Maria entered, her expression unreadable. "Chief," she said, her voice softer than usual, "I just wanted to say, thank you. For standing up. For showing us what real leadership looks like." Daniel offered a faint smile. "This isn't the end, Maria. There's still so much work to do." She nodded. "I know. But it's a start." As she left, Daniel turned to the window, looking out at the city he had sworn to protect. The protests had quieted, replaced by a cautious optimism. It wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was a step forward. And for Daniel, that was enough, for now. The precinct was quieter now. Most of the officers had returned to their duties, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air like an unspoken secret. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the neatly organized pile of papers in front of him. The noise from the earlier confrontation was gone, replaced by the dull hum of the city outside his window. A soft knock broke the silence, and Maria Lopez stepped into the room again. This time, her face carried a mix of exhaustion and concern. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Chief," she began, her voice softer now. Mathers didn't go quietly. Daniel looked up, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "He's outside," Maria said cautiously. "With reporters." Daniel's lips tightened into a thin line. Of course, Luke wouldn't go down without a fight. It was in his nature to lash out when cornered. Rising from his chair, Daniel adjusted his tie and nodded. "Let's go." As they made their way to the front of the building, the muffled voices of reporters and onlookers grew louder. Through the glass doors, Daniel could see Luke standing on the precinct steps, his arms gesturing wildly as he addressed a small crowd of journalists. The cameras were focused on him, capturing every word. "This is a disgrace," Luke shouted, his face red with anger. "I've served this city for over a decade, putting my life on the line, and this is the thanks I get. Suspended. Humiliated. All because I dared to enforce the law." Daniel stepped through the doors, and the crowd's attention shifted instantly. Reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras aimed at him. "Chief Carter," one of them called out. "What do you have to say about Officer Mather's accusations? Is this suspension a result of political pressure?" Another voice chimed in, "Do you think your decision was fair, considering Mather's record of service?" Daniel raised a hand, his calm demeanor silencing the chaos. His voice was steady but firm as he addressed the group. This isn't about politics, and it isn't about one officer's service record. This is about accountability. No one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. Luke interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Accountability? That's rich, coming from someone who hides behind a desk while the rest of us are out risking our lives. Daniel turned to face Luke directly, his expression unyielding. You're right about one thing, Mathers. I do sit behind a desk sometimes. But I also walk these streets. I listen to the people we serve. And what I've heard, over and over, is that they're tired. Tired of being mistreated. Tired of being afraid of the very people who are supposed to protect them. That's what this is about. The tension between the two men was electric, and the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Luke took a step closer, his voice lowering but no less venomous. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Standing up here, throwing me under the bus to make yourself look good. But you don't know what it's like out there. You don't know what it's like to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. Daniel didn't flinch. You're right, Luke. I don't know what it's like to make decisions out of fear. But I do know what it's like to lead with integrity. And that's what this department needs. The crowd erupted in a mix of murmurs and questions, but Daniel ignored them. He stepped closer to Luke, his voice dropping to a level only the two of them could hear. You had a choice, Luke. Every single day, you had a choice to do the right thing. And you didn't. That's on you. Luke's eyes narrowed, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again, but instead, he turned and stormed away, shoving past the reporters and disappearing into the city. The cameras turned back to Daniel, who took a deep breath before addressing the crowd one final time. We're not perfect, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his words. This department has made mistakes. I have made mistakes. But we're committed to doing better. To being better. And that starts with holding ourselves accountable. The crowd buzzed with questions, but Daniel raised his hand again. That's all I have to say for now. Thank you. Back inside, Daniel leaned against the wall of the hallway, the adrenaline finally beginning to wear off. Maria approached him, her expression unreadable. You handled that well, she said. Daniel let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. I don't know if it was enough. Maria placed a hand on his shoulder. It's a start, Chief. And sometimes, that's all we can do. As Daniel returned to his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The battle for accountability, for justice, was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that change was possible. Hopeful that his city could heal. And as he sat down, the faint sounds of the city outside his window, he allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve. Because he knew that the fight was worth it. The precinct settled into an uneasy quiet after the confrontation outside. Daniel returned to his office, but the buzz of the day lingered in every corner of the building. Officers whispered in hallways, their voices carrying a mix of shock and uncertainty. Some wondered what Luke Mathers would do next, while others were starting to question their own roles within a system that had allowed someone like him to thrive for so long. Daniel sat at his desk, the sound of a clock ticking faintly in the background. He wasn't sure if the silence in the precinct was a sign of progress or a prelude to more resistance. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment, before Maria walked in, holding a folder in her hand. Chief, she began, her voice steady but cautious, we've just received another set of complaints. This time, they're about Mathers' behavior on cases that go back years. One of them includes a false arrest that nearly ruined a man's life. Daniel took the folder from her, his jaw tightening as he flipped through the pages. False arrest, he repeated, more to himself than to Maria. How did this go unnoticed? Maria shifted uncomfortably. Some of the complaints were dismissed before they even reached internal affairs. It looks like someone higher up might have been protecting him. Daniel closed the folder, his mind racing. The implications were clear. Mathers wasn't just a rogue officer. He was part of a larger problem, one that extended beyond the actions of a single man. "We'll need to reopen these cases," Daniel said finally. "And not just Mathers. Every case where misconduct was reported but ignored. I want a full audit." Maria hesitated. "That's going to ruffle a lot of feathers, Chief. There are people in this department who won't want this to happen." Daniel met her gaze, his expression resolute. "Let them be uncomfortable. If we don't clean up our own house, who will?" Maria nodded, her respect for Daniel evident, and left the office to begin organizing the audit. Daniel sat back, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He knew this wouldn't just be about Mathers anymore. It would uncover a culture of complicity that would force the department, and the city, to confront uncomfortable truths. As the audit began, the ripple effects were felt immediately. Officers who had long been shielded from scrutiny now found themselves under the microscope. Old cases were re-examined, and new patterns of misconduct began to emerge. For some, the revelations were shocking; for others, they were a long overdue reckoning. Daniel held a series of town hall meetings with community leaders and residents to address the growing concerns. The first meeting was packed, the room buzzing with a mix of anger and hope. People wanted answers, and Daniel was determined to provide them. A man in the audience stood up during the Q&A portion of the meeting, his voice filled with emotion. "Chief Carter, I want to believe you. I really do. But we've been lied to before. We've been told things would change, and nothing ever did. Why should we trust you?" Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Because I'm not asking for your trust. Not yet. Trust has to be earned, and I know this department has a long way to go to earn it. But what I can promise you is this: we're not sweeping anything under the rug. Every complaint, every report, every piece of evidence is being examined. And we will hold people accountable." The man nodded slowly, his skepticism giving way to a cautious sense of hope. The room erupted into applause, but Daniel didn't let it distract him. This wasn't a victory lap, it was just another step in a much longer journey. Meanwhile, Luke Mathers was far from idle. After being escorted from the precinct, he had sought out legal counsel, determined to fight back. He began giving interviews to sympathetic media outlets, painting himself as a victim of political correctness gone too far. His rhetoric found a small but vocal audience, and soon, protests were staged in his support. Daniel watched the news coverage of the pro-Mathers demonstrations with a mix of frustration and resolve. He knew this backlash was inevitable. Change always came with resistance, especially from those who had the most to lose. One evening, as Daniel was leaving the precinct, he found Malcolm waiting for him outside. His son's face was serious, his usual playful demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. "Dad," Malcolm began, "can we talk?" Daniel nodded, unlocking the car as they got in. As they drove, Malcolm finally spoke. "I saw some of the stuff people are saying about you online. About the protests for that guy, Mathers. Are you okay?" Daniel glanced at his son, his heart heavy. "I'm fine, Malcolm. This comes with the territory." "But it's not fair," Malcolm said, his voice rising slightly. "You're trying to do the right thing, and people are acting like you're the bad guy." Daniel pulled over, turning to face his son. "Malcolm, listen to me. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, and it's almost never popular. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. People are going to say what they want. What matters is that we keep moving forward." Malcolm nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of pride and worry. "I just don't want to see you get hurt." Daniel smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "I've got you looking out for me. That's more than enough." Back at the precinct, the audit was nearing its conclusion, and the findings were explosive. Dozens of cases involving misconduct had been buried over the years, implicating not just officers but also members of the administration. The revelations sent shockwaves through the department, and Daniel knew that the hardest part was yet to come. He called a press conference to address the findings, standing before a room packed with reporters, community members, and officers. His voice was steady as he laid out the facts, sparing no detail. "This audit has revealed systemic failures within our department," Daniel said. "Failures that have allowed misconduct to go unchecked for far too long. Today, I am announcing the termination of several officers involved in these cases, as well as a complete restructuring of our oversight process." The room erupted with questions, but Daniel held up a hand. "I know this is just the beginning. Accountability isn't a one-time event, it's an ongoing process. And while I know there are people who will resist these changes, I want to be clear, we will not go back to the way things were." As Daniel stepped away from the podium, the weight of the moment settled on him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt that real progress was being made. In the days that followed, the protests died down, and the department began to rebuild. Daniel knew there would always be those who doubted him, who resisted change. But as he walked through the precinct, he saw something new in the eyes of his officers, a sense of accountability, of responsibility, that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a step in the right direction. And for Daniel, that was enough to keep going. The precinct felt like it was holding its breath in the days following the press conference. Daniel's announcement had sent shockwaves through the department and the city, but the tension hadn't subsided. Officers were quieter in the hallways, their conversations hushed, eyes darting cautiously as they passed one another. It was as though everyone was waiting for the next domino to fall. Daniel spent most of his time in his office, sifting through case files and reports. The audit had unearthed more than he'd anticipated, more patterns of misconduct, more officers complicit in covering for each other, and more cracks in a system he had spent his career trying to strengthen. The weight of it all bore down on him, but he refused to show it. Not to his team, not to the city, and certainly not to those who were rooting for his failure. One afternoon, Maria knocked on his door and stepped inside. She carried another folder, her expression serious but not without a hint of optimism. "Chief," she began, setting the folder on his desk, "we've finalized the findings from the audit. These are the last of the reports." Daniel looked up from his desk, his eyes tired but focused. "What's in this one?" Maria sat down, leaning forward slightly. "It's about Mathers. There's more than we initially thought. Financial inconsistencies, possible ties to some, less than legal activities. It's not just misconduct anymore. This could be criminal." Daniel opened the folder and scanned the pages, his face hardening as he read. The evidence was damning: payments from untraceable sources, suspicious activity reports, and records of cases Mathers had buried for what appeared to be personal gain. "This goes deeper than I thought," Daniel muttered, more to himself than to Maria. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "We're going to need to bring in the feds for this." Maria nodded. "I already made the call. They're sending a team tomorrow." Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You've been solid through all of this, Maria. I couldn't have done it without you." She smiled faintly. "I believe in what you're trying to do, Chief. It's not easy, but it's right." Before Maria could leave, Daniel's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen and saw Malcolm's name. Picking up, he answered, "Hey, Malcolm. What's up?" There was a pause on the other end before Malcolm's voice came through, low and uncertain. "Dad, you might want to come home. There's someone outside the house." Daniel sat up straight, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean? Who's outside?" "I don't know," Malcolm replied, his voice tight. "There's a guy in a hoodie just standing across the street. He's been there for a while, just watching. Daniel's mind raced, but his voice remained calm. Lock the doors and stay inside. I'm on my way. He hung up and grabbed his coat, motioning to Maria. I've got to go. Keep an eye on things here. Maria frowned, sensing his urgency. Everything okay? Daniel hesitated for a moment before nodding. Just something I need to handle. The drive home was tense, his grip on the steering wheel tighter than usual. He parked a block away and approached the house cautiously, his eyes scanning the street. Sure enough, there was a man standing across the way, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. The man didn't move as Daniel approached, but his posture shifted slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of his presence. Can I help you with something? Daniel called out, his voice steady. The man looked up, his face now fully visible. It was Tom Greer, one of Luke Mather's closest friends on the force. Daniel's stomach sank slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. Greer, Daniel said, his tone cool. What are you doing here? Greer took a step forward, his hands in his pockets. Just wanted to talk, Chief. Off the record. Daniel crossed his arms, maintaining a safe distance. You've got my attention. What's this about? Greer glanced around, as if ensuring they were alone. Mathers is unraveling, he said finally. He's been talking to people, saying things he shouldn't. He's desperate. And? Daniel prompted, his patience thin. And he's blaming you for everything, Greer continued. He's saying you set him up, that this whole thing is a witch hunt. He's convinced he's the victim here. Daniel exhaled slowly, his irritation masked by his calm demeanor. Mathers made his choices. He's responsible for the consequences. Greer hesitated, his expression conflicted. Look, I'm not defending him. But you should know he's not going to go down quietly. He's talking about bringing you down with him. Daniel stepped closer, his voice lowering. Let me be clear, Greer. If Mathers has anything to say, he can say it to the investigators. But if he tries to come after me or my family, there will be consequences. Understood? Greer nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. Understood. As Greer walked away, Daniel returned to the house, his mind racing. Malcolm was waiting for him at the door, his face filled with concern. Who was it? Malcolm asked. Just someone from work, Daniel replied, ruffling his son's hair in an attempt to ease the tension. It's handled. But it wasn't handled. Not yet. Mathers' desperation made him unpredictable, and Daniel knew the coming days would be critical. Back at the precinct, the arrival of federal investigators created another ripple of tension. Files were seized, interviews conducted, and a clearer picture of Mathers' actions began to emerge. The corruption ran deep, implicating not only Mathers but also several others who had turned a blind eye to his behavior. Daniel stood in the hallway, watching as agents carried boxes of evidence to their vehicles. Maria approached him, her expression serious. This is going to get ugly, isn't it? She asked. It already is, Daniel replied. But it's necessary. As the day turned into night, Daniel sat alone in his office, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The choices he had made had set this all in motion, and while he knew they were the right ones, the consequences were far-reaching. His phone buzzed again, a text from Malcolm, "Stay safe, Dad. Proud of you." Daniel smiled faintly, the message a small but powerful reminder of why he was fighting so hard. This wasn't just about the department or the city. It was about building a future where Malcolm, and everyone else, could feel safe and valued. As he looked out the window at the city lights, Daniel knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that it was a fight worth winning. The precinct was a hive of quiet tension as the federal investigators dug deeper into the files. Officers whispered in corners, casting cautious glances at the agents moving in and out with boxes of evidence. The walls seemed to buzz with the unspoken fear of what might come next. The atmosphere felt heavier with each passing hour. Daniel sat in the conference room with Maria, a whiteboard covered in notes and timelines in front of them. Papers were spread across the table, the sheer volume of evidence against Luke Mathers and others almost overwhelming. Maria leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "This is worse than we thought," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "The deeper we dig, the more it looks like Mathers wasn't just rogue. He was part of something bigger." Daniel nodded, his face grim. "It's a network. Cover-ups, false reports, even bribes. And it wasn't just him. There are others in this department who let it happen, or helped." Maria looked at him, concern etched into her features. "How do we fix this, Chief? Where do we even start?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the mess of documents before him. "We start by dismantling it piece by piece. Mathers is the key. If we can prove his actions were part of a larger system, we'll have the leverage we need to clean house." As if on cue, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was one of the federal agents working the case. He answered, his tone professional but tense. "Carter." The voice on the other end was brisk. "Chief, we've secured enough evidence to bring charges against Mathers. We're moving in to arrest him now. I thought you should know." Daniel leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Good. But be careful. He's volatile." The agent hesitated. "There's something else. Mathers has been reaching out to people, former colleagues, allies in the department. He's trying to rally support. You should prepare for backlash." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "Understood. Keep me updated." He hung up and turned to Maria, his expression unreadable. "They're arresting him." Maria's eyes widened slightly. "Today?" "Now," Daniel confirmed. He stood and began gathering the documents on the table. "But this isn't over. Mathers won't go quietly, and if he's been reaching out to others, we need to be ready." The arrest unfolded as Daniel had expected, chaotic and tense. Mathers was holed up in a small house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a few of his staunchest supporters. When the federal agents arrived, Mathers resisted, shouting accusations and threats as they led him out in handcuffs. The scene was caught on camera by local news crews, and within hours, it was plastered across every major outlet. Back at the precinct, the reactions were mixed. Some officers were visibly relieved, glad to see Mathers finally facing justice. Others were more subdued, their loyalty to him making them uneasy about what his arrest might reveal. Daniel convened a meeting with his senior staff, the atmosphere in the room heavy with anticipation. He stood at the head of the table, his posture commanding but not unkind. "As you all know," he began, his voice steady, "Luke Mathers has been arrested on charges that include corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against him is overwhelming, and this department will cooperate fully with the investigation." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But this isn't just about Mathers. This is about the culture that allowed someone like him to thrive. We're not just rooting out one bad apple, we're overhauling the entire system." One of the officers, a younger man named Jenkins, raised his hand hesitantly. "Chief, with all due respect, what's going to happen to the rest of us? To those of us who weren't involved but didn't speak up?" Daniel met his gaze, his expression softening slightly. "Jenkins, silence can be complicity. But it can also be fear. My goal isn't to punish good officers who felt powerless to act. My goal is to create a department where you don't feel that fear anymore. Where doing the right thing is the standard, not the exception." The room fell silent, the weight of Daniel's words pressing on everyone present. Slowly, heads began to nod, a sense of reluctant agreement spreading through the group. Meanwhile, Mathers' arrest sent shockwaves through the city. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, some calling for more accountability, others defending Mathers and accusing Daniel of orchestrating a witch hunt. The media frenzy was relentless, and Daniel found himself fielding questions from every direction. During a press briefing, a reporter asked, "Chief Carter, do you think the arrest of Luke Mathers will restore public trust in your department?" Daniel's response was measured but firm. Trust isn't restored with one action. It's built over time, through consistent accountability and transparency. This arrest is a step in the right direction, but it's not the end. We still have a long way to go. Another reporter chimed in, "Do you fear retaliation from within the department?" Mathers had allies, didn't he? Daniel didn't hesitate. Retaliation is always a risk when you challenge the status quo. But fear isn't an excuse for inaction. My job is to lead, not to avoid conflict. And I will continue to lead this department with integrity, no matter the challenges. The room buzzed with murmurs as Daniel left the podium, his resolve unwavering. But beneath the surface, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of unease. Mathers was unpredictable, and the network of corruption he had exposed was far-reaching. Daniel knew the fight was far from over. Later that evening, Daniel returned home, the exhaustion of the day evident in his movements. Malcolm was waiting for him in the living room, the news playing softly on the TV. "Dad," Malcolm said, his tone cautious, "are you okay?" Daniel smiled faintly, sitting down beside his son. "I'm fine, Malcolm. Just a long day." Malcolm frowned, his eyes fixed on the screen. "They're saying you're making enemies. That people in the department don't like what you're doing." Daniel sighed, placing a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "Change always comes with resistance. But it's worth it. For you, for this city, it's worth it." Malcolm nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Daniel smiled, the weight on his shoulders feeling slightly lighter. "Thanks, son. That means a lot." But as the night wore on, Daniel found himself staring out the window, his mind racing with thoughts of what was still to come. The battle for justice was far from over, and the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. Yet, despite the uncertainty, he felt a sense of purpose that kept him moving forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But Daniel was ready to face them. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, community leaders, and officers, all waiting for the verdict. Luke Mathers sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of defiance. His legal team had argued tirelessly, painting him as a scapegoat, but the evidence was undeniable. The charges against him ranged from corruption to abuse of power, and his actions had set off a reckoning within the department and the city as a whole. Daniel sat quietly in the gallery, his presence unassuming yet commanding. This wasn't a victory lap for him, it was a moment of accountability. He'd come to represent more than just himself, he was a symbol of change, a leader who had chosen to act when others wouldn't. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The clerk stood, reading the verdict with a steady voice. "On the charges of corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of approval. Mathers' face reddened as the reality of his situation sank in. The judge continued, detailing his sentence: years in federal prison and restitution to the victims of his misconduct. Mathers glanced back at the gallery, his eyes meeting Daniel's for a brief, charged moment. Daniel held his gaze, unflinching. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only resolve. After the sentencing, Daniel stepped outside, greeted by a wave of reporters and supporters. The protests against him had faded, replaced by a cautious optimism in the community. He addressed the crowd with the same measured confidence that had carried him through the entire ordeal. "This isn't just about one man," he said. "It's about rebuilding trust. It's about creating a system where accountability isn't the exception but the rule. We've made progress, but there's still work to be done. And together, we'll keep moving forward." The applause that followed was genuine, but Daniel knew the journey was far from over. Maria Lopez stood in her office, her expression one of quiet pride. The reforms she and Daniel had initiated were beginning to take root. Officers who had once been complicit or silent were now stepping forward, embracing the new standards of transparency and accountability. She had been promoted to deputy chief, a role that gave her even greater influence in shaping the future of the department. Daniel visited her office later that day, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Deputy Chief Lopez," he said with a faint smile. "How does it feel?" Maria chuckled. "Overwhelming, but in the best way. We've come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," Daniel agreed. "And we've got a long way to go. But I couldn't have done this without you, Maria. You've been the backbone of this entire effort." Maria looked at him, her expression softening. "Neither of us could have done it alone. This was a team effort, Chief." At home, Daniel found Malcolm waiting for him with a broad grin. "So, the bad guy got what he deserved, huh?" Malcolm said, tossing a basketball back and forth between his hands. Daniel laughed softly, ruffling Malcolm's hair. "Something like that. But it's not about just one person, Malcolm. It's about making sure things change for the better, for everyone." Malcolm nodded, his youthful confidence shining through. "You're doing it, Dad. You're making things better." Those words stuck with Daniel long after Malcolm had gone to bed. He stood on the porch, looking out over the quiet street, and let the weight of everything that had happened settle. It wasn't a perfect victory, change never was. But it was real, and it was meaningful. And that was enough. For Mathers, the story ended in isolation. Stripped of his badge and his freedom, he faced years behind bars with no allies to shield him. His downfall was a stark reminder of what happens when power is abused and trust is betrayed. The very system he had exploited was now holding him accountable. For the department, the road ahead was challenging but hopeful. Reforms were underway, community relations were improving, and officers like Jenkins were stepping into leadership roles, determined to create a better environment for both their colleagues and the citizens they served. As for Daniel, he remained at the helm, guiding the department through its transformation. He knew the spotlight wouldn't last forever and that the hard work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that change was truly possible. Reflecting on the journey, Daniel addressed his team one final time in a quiet meeting. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice steady. "But change isn't a destination, it's a process. And it's one we're committed to. Together." To those watching this story unfold, the message is clear: change is never easy. It requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But it's worth it. Because accountability isn't just about punishment, it's about creating a better future for everyone. What did this story mean to you? Did it resonate with your own experiences, or did it challenge your perspective? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together, we can continue the conversation about justice, accountability, and the power of doing what's right. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more impactful narratives that challenge and inspire. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, take care, and remember, change starts with us.